Hi, this is Jeff Jacob, pastor at Loretto United Methodist Church. Today is Good Friday, and as a meditation, we are going to rehearse the Stations of the Cross, and we're using Stations of the Cross coloring pages that our church has colored during the season of Lent. The Stations of the Cross coloring posters and pages were created by artist Adam Walker Cleveland and were originally launched by Illustrated Children's Ministry in 2017. Given that the Illustrated Children's Ministry community comes from over 60 different denominations around the world, some of whom may not be familiar with the Stations of the Cross, they decided to create illustrations based on the 14 scriptural Stations of the Cross, which Pope John Paul II introduced on Good Friday in 1991. To guide our meditation, I'll be reading from the devotion, a companion that goes with the Stations of the Cross coloring pages. There's an old legend that says, after the death and resurrection of Jesus, his mother Mary would often walk the way her son had walked on his journey to the cross, pausing here and there to recall something that had happened at that spot. From these walks grew the early Christian practice of walking the Via Dolorosa, the way of the cross, in Jerusalem, a tradition that continues to this day. When they returned home, those early pilgrims to Jerusalem talked about their experiences, and soon many people began erecting stations of the cross on the walls and grounds of their own churches so worshipers could make the journey whenever they wished. The number of stations ranged from as few as 7 to as many as 30. Over time, however, the number became fixed at 14, including 5 stations depicting events that are not found in Scripture: the 3 falls of Jesus, the meeting with Mary, and the legend of Veronica's veil. On Good Friday 1991, Pope John Paul II introduced the 14 scriptural stations of the cross that many Christians now use. Catholic and Orthodox Christians were the first ones to use the stations in their devotional life. In recent years, Christians of many traditions have been rediscovering this ancient devotional practice. The story of Jesus' final hours, traditionally called the Passion, is the central story in each of the 4 Gospels. It is a story where all familiar with, yet each gospel writer tells it from a different perspective. Jesus' own journey to the cross did not take place down some sacred street. Rather, his journey is what made each step, each cobblestone, sacred and filled with the divine. At first glance, a large coloring poster might seem or might not seem like the most obvious place to meditate on these final hours of Jesus' life. But it is our hope that by coloring them and talking about them outside of our traditional sacred places, we can recognize that every place is an opportunity for an encounter with Christ along our own journey of faith. Let's go now to the Stations of the Cross, beginning with Station 1, called Sorrow. I will be reading from Matthew chapter 26, verses 36 through 41. So Jesus went with them to the place called Gethsemane. "You sit here," he said to the disciples, "while I go over there and pray." He took Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee with him and began to be very upset and distressed. "My soul is overwhelmed with grief," he said, "even to death. Stay here and keep watch with me." Then going a little further on, he fell on his face and prayed. "My Father," he said, "if it's possible, please let this cup go away from me. But not what I want, what you want." He came back to the disciples and found them asleep. So he said to Peter, "Couldn't you keep watch with me for a single hour? Watch and pray so that you don't get pulled down into the time of testing. The spirit is eager, but the body is weak." want to say a couple of things. First of all, this station begins in the garden, and all of Scripture, the whole story of our faith begins in a garden. And at least for humanity, and there, the turning point was their disobedience. In the Garden of Gethsemane, we see Jesus fully yielding to his relationship with the Father, completely in tune with the Father, and we see complete obedience. Another turning point. Also, as we think about the name of this station called Sorrow, our nation is currently going through deep sorrow concerning the loss of life due to the coronavirus. Thousands have died. Thousands have lost loved ones. Many people have lost jobs, and most of us have been quarantined to homes and have had a period of time where we've been out of touch with relationships, so we feel great loss and sorrow because of that as well. So as we meditate upon this station, we think about that Jesus and the disciples are there in the Garden of Gethsemane. And Jesus, in this moment of deepest sorrow, is in great pain. But notice he's not alone. The scriptures say that Jesus went with the disciples. He then took his most trusted friends, Peter, James, and John, with him as he began the painful journey that would ultimately lead to new life. Although we tend to give them a bad rap for falling asleep 3 times, it's worth noting that at least they were present with Jesus in these moments in the garden. While most of us will not make history-altering decisions in our lifetimes, we all have moments of deep sorrow when we need to be surrounded by the love of our friends, especially those in the community of faith. Take a look at the picture before you. How many tears do you see? As you begin this journey to the cross with Jesus, remember that you're not alone. Remember also that as Psalm 30 verse 5 says, "At night we may cry, but when morning comes, we will celebrate." So as you reflect on Station 1, when have you faced a crisis and needed to turn to others for support or prayer? How did it make you feel to have to rely on them? Meditate on Station 1, sorrow. Now let's move to Station 2, called betrayal. It's where Jesus, betrayed by Judas, is arrested. We'll be reading from Mark chapter 14, verses 43 through 46. At once, while he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived, and accompanied by a crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests, the legal experts, and the elders. The betrayer had given them a coded sign: "The one I kiss, that's him. Seize him and take him away safely." He came up to Jesus at once. "Rabbi," he said, and kissed him. The crowd laid hands on him and seized him. Someone once said that the saddest thing about betrayal is that it never comes from your enemies. And so it was with Jesus and Judas. The scriptures are quick to point out that Judas was one of the 12. It could even be argued that he was one of the more influential members of the inner circle. After all, he was the treasurer who made sure there was enough money to carry on the mission of building the kingdom. And yet it was this one of the 12 who betrayed Jesus, setting in motion events that would ultimately lead to Jesus' crucifixion. We will never know why Judas betrayed Jesus. Some people believe it was because he had no choice. It was all part of God's preordained plan. Others think it was because Judas was hungry for power and control of the group. Whatever his motives, his betrayal ultimately cost Jesus his life. Take a look at the picture before you. Close to the betrayer's lips is an object that looks oddly like a crescent moon. It's John's account of the Last Supper. After Judas gets up from the table to betray Jesus to the chief priests, John writes, "And it was night." When have you used your own position of trust to betray someone close to you? Have you ever been let down by a close friend or family member? How did you choose to deal with your feelings? Station 2, betrayal.